When I was about 9 years old, I remember going to a local video rental store with my parents. This place was full of VHS tapes, movie posters, a shady room full of pornography, and more importantly, video games. We used to go here to rent stuff all the time, that is until they closed their doors alongside most other video rental establishments. The name of this magical place was called All Star Video, and it was here that I was first introduced to games like Rocket Knight Adventures, Ristar, Boogerman, and dozens of other Genesis titles I would later add to my own collection. But this store had one other trick up its sleeve, because not only did they just rent out video games, but they also rented out entire game consoles as well, such as the still relatively new Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. And it was during one of these rare occasions where I could convince my parents to drop 20 bones for 2 nights of PlayStation use that I had my first run-in with Spyro the Dragon.
But he breathes fire. He's napalm on 4 scaly legs. And he headbutts. Just look what he did to me!
I remember seeing this game case on the shelf enticing all that walked by, ready to be rented alongside the system that I wouldn't own for several more years. I'd see Spyro in commercials as part of sweepstakes on Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network, on the back of booklets and other PS1 games, and even advertised on PlayStation posters in the gaming department of my local Walmart. To say that I was hyped to play Spyro was an understatement. However, it seemed like every time I was able to rent the PlayStation out for a couple of days, Spyro, the game I wanted to play the most, always seemed to be checked out already, so I always had to settle for other games like Resident Evil and Croc. And I never did get to play Spyro. In fact, for one reason or another, I've never actually played any game in the series, which has left a pretty sizable gap in my gaming repertoire, come to think of it. But you know, it's 2018, which means the 20th anniversary of this game was like 2 days ago, and with a remaster of the original trilogy of Spyro games hanging over the heads of eager fans everywhere, now just feels like the right time to dive into this series, give my thoughts, and see if I can finally, after 20 years, consider myself a Spyro fan. And because I'm absolutely crazy, we're not just taking a look at all the classics in the franchise, but all the duds as well. In fact, I'm going to be critiquing every game in the series, and when I say every game, I mean every game. I've definitely got my work cut out for me, as there are well over 13 different games in the series, spanning multiple generations, consoles, and handhelds. It's not gonna be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. So I hope you'll join me over the next few months as we take a deep dive into the series known as Spyro the Dragon. Spyro the Dragon, for those who aren't in the know, was developed by Insomniac Games for the PS1 as their first foray into the world of the budding 3D platformer genre. In it, you play as Spyro, a young dragon who likes to headbutt bad guys, glide through the air, and incinerate defenseless forest creatures. Taking inspiration from contemporaries such as Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot while providing its own unique spin, Spyro the Dragon has you exploring many different worlds, collecting thousands of pieces of treasure, and taking out all the baddies that stand in your way. Believe it or not, this was only the second game that Insomniac had ever developed, following up the critical success but commercial failure of their first game, Disruptor. Prior to its development, Insomniac had entered into a 3-game deal with the now defunct Universal Studios Interactive, who would both publish and distribute the game as well as act as the licensing holder. That last bit's going to be important to remember later on. The team was smart enough to recognize that gritty first-person shooters along the lines of Doom and Quake were still struggling to gain traction outside of the PC market, so for their second title, they opted to make a more cartoony mascot platformer, which at the time was making quite the impressive comeback now that the bugs of platforming in 3D space had largely been ironed out, thanks almost entirely to Mario 64. And thus, in September of 1998, Insomniac saw Spyro the Dragon released to both critical and commercial success, becoming the 17th most sold PS1 game and a must-own for any collector of the system. But I mean, it's been 20 years, and this is the generation that's known for having a lot of games that everyone loved back in the day, but aren't looked as favorably upon anymore. So the question is, does Spyro hold up? Well, let's find out. The game opens up with this rather odd cutscene that features the dragons being interviewed for a TV spot or documentary of all things.
Okay, rolling.
Oh, it's been peaceful here in the 5 worlds, or is it 6, for a dragon's age. We now have 12,000 treasure, or is it 14,000?
Okay, so setting aside the fact that when I think about dragons, I definitely don't think about film crews and boom mics, just what the hell is going on with this scene? I don't actually have an answer for you, I'm just asking the question because who in their right mind opens a game about dragons like this? But I gotta say, you managed to hook me, definitely did not expect the game to open like that. Anyway, while this interview or whatever is taking place, one of the dragons starts bad-mouthing a local villain by the name of Nasty Nork. And Nasty, who can hear them apparently, starts getting a little cheesed off, as the kids say.
Nasty Nork is a simple creature.
Simple.
He has been contained in a remote world and is no threat to the Dragon Kingdom. No threat! Besides, he is ugly. That does it!
Nasty then casts a spell that turns all the dragons in the land into crystal, except for Spyro, who suddenly has adventure and responsibility thrust upon him, and it's here that Spyro must now prepare himself for the adventure of a lifetime, cast away his childhood, and become the reluctant hero he was destined to be. Just think what he must be feeling right now, knowing that if he should fail, his entire race will be forever trapped within a crystalline prison, and their memory forgotten to the passage of time. But even still, Spyro, feeling the entire weight of the world upon his shoulders, stands proudly and cries out,
Looks like I've got some things to do.
I mean, you could go with that, too, that works. Okay, seriously, what the hell is wrong with you? Your entire race just got turned into crystal, and you are literally the only one who can save them, yet rather than feeling a sense of duty or even the least bit upset as to what's only just transpired, your first reaction is to respond as though you've remembered another task you need to add to your to-do list? Let's see, I need to go to the bank, get some groceries, I should probably free my entire race and family from eternal imprisonment, but I'm gonna need to get lunch too. And Chipotle is having that buy one get one free burrito sale today, definitely don't want to miss that. You know what, it can wait until tomorrow, it's fine, they'll be fine. I'm sorry to focus on this opening sequence so much, but this has gotta be one of the laziest attempts at introducing a setup and main character I have ever seen. It'd be a different story if the entire game featured the fourth wall being broken or some meta commentary on how 3D platformers function as a vehicle for delivering a story, but this opening sequence and the equally lazy closing cutscene are the only moments the game does this, making them feel really out of place with the rest of the themes and narrative, which ends up being pretty paint by numbers as far as video game stories go. I guess I should be happy that the opening's short and sweet and lets you get right into the action, but I'm just more confused as to how a game that has this level of production value with fully voiced characters, facial expressions, and somewhat synced mouth movements could drop the ball so hard in the first 10 seconds. Like, wow! Anyway, after that confusing mess of an opening is over, you're thrust right into the game and left to run around. As you might imagine, your goal is to find and free all the captured dragons in each stage, as well as collect all the treasure that's apparently been stolen and scattered throughout the land. The game is broken up into several different worlds that act as a sort of hub, which allows you to travel to various levels of a similar theme. But what's unique about Spyro versus most other 3D platformers is that these hub stages require you to accomplish the same tasks as those found in the main levels. Typically, 3D platformers have a hub area that only serves to act as the connective tissue that binds the real stages together. Think of Peach's Castle in Mario 64 or Gruntilda's Lair in Banjo-Kazooie. These hub worlds usually have a few things to do and collect here and there, and there's usually a MacGuffin or two to find, but overall all the real challenges and puzzles are reserved for the main stages. Spyro, in contrast, treats its hub worlds just like any other level, filling them with MacGuffins and treasure for you to collect along the way. And in fact, this is exactly how the boss stages are structured as well, giving each stage you go to the same feel and sense of cohesion as the rest of the game, which I actually really liked. This aspect gives the game an even sense of progression from start to finish, rather than following the typical pattern of find the level's entrance in the hub, go beat the level and collect everything, find the next level's entrance of the hub, go beat that level and collect everything. Spyro's worlds and levels play out in a more linear fashion that always keeps the player's focus on the game's primary goals, finding treasure and freeing dragons. I'm in a new stage, and my goal is to find some treasure and free some dragons. I just made it to a new hub world, and now I need to find some treasure and free some dragons. Oh look, a boss level, I should probably find some treasure and free some dragons. No matter where you go or what the theme of the area you're in is, your goal never changes. The circumstances and mechanics needed to accomplish these goals can change from level to level, but at the very least, you always know what you need to do. And I like this straightforward design of Spyro. It's a very elegant way to keep the game's primary mechanics as the player's focus, and it also gives the game a consistent tone and smooth difficulty progression that's based less on the player's own skill and more on the intricate design of each level. For example, think about Banjo-Kazooie and how it approaches its collective elements. Here, your primary goals are to collect jiggies and notes so you can progress through the game. However, collecting these items usually isn't as simple as just finding them and picking them up, because you may have to solve a puzzle or defeat a series of enemies or collect 5 Jinjos or become a pumpkin or whatever. This makes the items in Banjo-Kazooie the reward for accomplishing the task rather than the task itself. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this style of play. In fact, if I'm being honest, I actually prefer Banjo-Kazooie's manner of collection overall, but still, I think there's something to be said for the elegant way that Spyro goes about fixating on its primary mechanics. This linearity is also reflected in the layout of each level, which all have a clear beginning, middle, and end to them with a fairly straightforward route connecting these points. Well, that is for all the levels except for those that feature Spyro flying through the air. In these flight levels, your goal is to activate or destroy a series of items which will reward you with treasure once completed, which actually makes them feel really disconnected disconnected from the rest of the game, come to think of it. These range from lighting lighthouses to flying through hoops or destroying planes as they fly about. It's a neat concept for a level and a nice way to shake things up a bit, but personally, I found them to be a little too repetitive and a bit frustrating due to the way the levels are structured as well as how things are laid out. I wouldn't say they're bad, and flying through the air does work quite well, but I think they could stand to be a bit more tightly designed, and truthfully, they feel very much tacked on and gimmicky in my opinion. The rest of the game, however, caught me by surprise as to just how well everything's held up. Spyro's primary levels actually remind me a great deal of those found in Super Mario Galaxy in the way that they have a clear beginning and ending point with some branching paths and hidden areas built around the linear layout of the level. Again, I personally prefer a good sandbox level that allows you to tackle challenges at your own pace, but there's this sort of laid-back charm to Spyro's level structure that just isn't seen in a lot of 3D platformers. And truthfully, I do think this linear level design does fit better with Spyro's moveset and the primary mechanics of the game. For example, each level was clearly designed with Spyro's charge maneuver in mind, so each is set up almost like a racetrack of sorts that you can play around on and explore at your leisure. You could, if you were so inclined, run from the start of the level to the end with only minimal platforming and combat standing in your way. And since the primary MacGuffin, your imprisoned brethren, are more often than not found along the beaten path and act more as checkpoints than collectibles, you could very easily play this game as if it were a linear level-by-level title and ignore most of the collective mechanics if you really wanted to. This also brings up another aspect of Spyro that sets it apart from a lot of other 3D platformers, and that's how it characterizes the items you collect. Whether it be a fellow dragon or a piece of treasure, everything you're looking for has a personal connection to Spyro himself. This gives more purpose to the game's collective elements because, unlike Mario 64 or, again, Banjo-Kazooie, you aren't just collecting a shiny, lifeless object just for the sake of collecting them, but are instead rescuing a member of Spyro's family or an item of great importance to their race and culture. And at least for me, I felt more compelled to track down and free every dragon and collect every piece of treasure simply because I felt like I was righting the wrongs committed against these characters rather than just marking off a checklist for the sake of completeness. Also, it's a good thing the developers had the sense to characterize the game's collectibles in this manner, because outside of unlocking an extra level at the end of the game, there really isn't any reason to collect treasure or free more than the required number of dragons. And that level you unlock, you know what you do? You collect more treasure. Hooray! Though you also get an extra ending cutscene, but really it only amounts to, hey kid, congratulations for beating the game, getting all the treasure and obtaining 120%. Now fuck off and go buy Spyro 2. Another thing that differentiates the collectibles in Spyro from those of other games is that Spyro's dragons really aren't all that hard to find, and as previously mentioned, come across more as checkpoints in the level rather than the reward for solving a puzzle or accomplishing a task. And again, most of them are found directly on the main route from the start of each level until the exit, so just by virtue of playing through the stage, you're likely to come across most, if not all, of your imprisoned comrades who, once freed, also provide you with some hints as to some of the more tricky aspects of the game or build upon the lore and background of this world.
Thank you for releasing me.
Or they'll say like 2 words and then fuck off at the speed of light. Adding to this laid-backness is a moderate difficulty curve and a primarily straightforward combat system. All the enemies are fairly easy to defeat, the platforming usually isn't too intense, and with the exception of the stupid hidden beach key found in the first level, everything is pretty easy to find. You also have a few extra tasks to accomplish, like chasing down egg thieves, and occasionally you'll come across a tricky section, but overall, Spyro is a fairly easy game. Even if you fail and die, the game doesn't really punish you all that much, only putting you back as far as the last dragon you've rescued while allowing you to keep all of the treasure you found prior to dying. Though that doesn't mean the game is without its frustrating moments, which will occasionally blindside you like the aforementioned hidden beach key and this asshole right here. As I played through this game, I was honestly surprised at just how well the gameplay has held up over the years. There's a certain appeal to just making your way through each world, collecting treasure and freeing dragons at your leisure, all the while not really having to worry about tricky enemy encounters or brain-bending puzzles like you typically find in most games of the genre. However, I can see some becoming bored with what Spyro has to offer simply because there really isn't that much to challenge the player outside of just collecting pieces of treasure and finding each dragon, most of which you'll come across anyway without really even trying. Hell, even the boss battles are pretty laid back, amounting more to a game of cat and mouse than an actual round of combat. And as you might expect, these levels are structured just like the hub worlds and main stages in that you have a linear route with some branching paths and some treasure and dragons to collect along the way, further selling the boss levels as just another area rather than a unique challenge. Again, I can see this turning off a few players just because of how different Spyro is from a lot of other 3D platformers, but personally, I found this to be a really refreshing way to take the genre in a different direction from the usual fare, and I'm honestly surprised that more games haven't built upon this style of play over the years. Though as much as I did find myself enjoying Spyro, I do have to admit there are a few places where the game hasn't aged all that well. To begin with, let's talk about those controls. Don't worry, I'm not going to say they suck or anything like that, because I actually think they're pretty solid. I mean, that is if you use a DualShock controller over the standard PS1 gamepad, because otherwise everything's pretty damn clunky, though that's more the fault of the hardware and not the game, since everything was clearly designed with an analog control scheme in mind, and thank goodness for that. You move Spyro about using the thumbstick or D-pad if you absolutely have to, and everything's fairly precise. Not anywhere near as precise as, say, Super Mario Odyssey or A Hat in Time, but by 1998 standards, Spyro's controls are about as good as you could get, managing to outclass roughly 90% of the games of this era by a pretty wide margin. But of course, it isn't just the way you move about the world that makes Spyro's controls nice and tight, but the myriad of abilities and how you utilize them as well. Pressing the circle button allows you to breathe fire, which you can use to dispatch enemies, break chests that contain treasure, and, as previously mentioned, murder innocent forest creatures. Okay, so this forest creature murder actually serves a purpose rather than just letting budding serial killers get their kicks, because this is how you gain back some health. These creatures that you burn to a crisp are called fodder, and they can be found all over each level to the point that you'll rarely find yourself without some extra health on hand. Spyro's health is represented by this little dragonfly named Sparks that follows you around wherever you go, with the color that surrounds him indicating how many hits you have left. If Sparks is gold, you'll have 4 hits remaining, blue you have 3, green 2, and if Sparks disappears, that means if you take just one more hit, you'll die. This is a pretty cool way to indicate how much health you have left, and it also gave the developers the opportunity to have the game's HUD elements hide themselves after a short period of time, giving Spyro this really clean and minimalistic look, which furthers the laid-back nature of the game without obstructing the action on screen. However, the downside of this is that sometimes it can be a little difficult to tell how much health you have left at a quick glance, and the game doesn't really tell you how this health system works other than indicating that you need to pay attention to Sparks, so you kinda just have to figure it out. Though to be fair, the way the game is designed overall, with its minimal challenge and easygoing nature, minimizes much of the issues this design choice could have caused. Then there's Spyro's main attack, which is the aforementioned charging maneuver that doubles as your sprint. Tapping square causes Spyro to perform a headbutt, though if you hold the button you'll instead charge forward, horns first, and enemies and breakable objects. And trust me, you're going to be doing this a lot. Spyro moves along at a pretty leisurely pace normally, which is fine for most sections of the game, but for larger areas, utilizing this attack as a way to run becomes almost necessary to keep the pace of the game up. Not only does it basically double your movement speed, but around 2/3 of the enemies are vulnerable to this attack, and beyond that, it just feels damn good to use and really gives the game a distinct sense of flow from start to finish. And of course, this wouldn't be a 3D platformer without jumping, which you activate by pressing the X button. Hitting the X button while in mid-air causes you to perform a glide, which can be used to reach distant platforms and slow your descent. The glide maneuver continues until you run into a wall or land on the ground, but you can also tap the triangle button to cancel your glide mid-flight. And this works fairly well, but I found having to hit a separate button to cancel the glide to be a little clunkier than it really should have been. Hitting the X button a second time while airborne makes perfect sense to activate the glide, but having to hit a separate button to cancel it is just sort of odd in my opinion. I think it would have been better if you simply had to hold the X button to glide, which I found myself doing anyway, and then cancel it by letting go. Though I imagine the glide cancel was designed this way so that you could breathe fire while gliding, which would be a little awkward to perform if you also had to keep the X button held the whole time. But here's the thing, there's like maybe one spot in the entire game where you'd need to breathe fire while gliding, so it seems a bit unnecessary to have a button dedicated solely to canceling another ability, just to make using 2 abilities in tandem a little easier. But beyond that minor issue, everything functions just as it should, culminating in a control scheme that's held up surprisingly well over the years, and even though Spyro's moveset is relatively simple, there's still a wealth of different options available to you when dealing with enemies and challenges along your journey. Another area where Spyro has aged pretty well comes in the form of its presentation and production values. To begin with, Insomniac and Universal Interactive went the extra mile by having the characters be fully voiced with some pretty stellar vocal performances from veterans in the entertainment industry. Games that featured this much spoken dialogue were still relatively rare back in 1998, and of the games that did take this extra step, most of them featured some pretty shoddy vocal work, which usually consisted of the game's developers, artists, or amateur voice actors the team could hire on the cheap.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
Spyro the Dragon, however, features some top-tier vocal talent from the likes of Clancy Brown, who also does the voice of Mr. Krabs on SpongeBob, and Carlos Alazraqui, who did the voice of Spyro himself, along with dozens of other characters from this era.
What about Nasty Nork? I'm going after him.
Oh baby, oh baby, oh baby. Rocco? Mrs. Bighead?
Though the game does reuse their voices over and over again to cover all 80 dragons and side characters, so that top tier talent starts to get spread pretty thin by the time the game is all said and done with, but even still, it's nice to hear some vocal work from this era that doesn't make me want to staple my ears shut. On top of this is a pretty awesome soundtrack composed by Stuart Copeland, who's probably best known as the drummer of The Police. Most of the tracks have a similar vibe to them, and they can be a little derivative of a singular musical idea in my opinion, but truthfully, I think this sameness fits the tone very well, lending a great deal to the laid-back yet punchy pace of the game as a whole. And honestly, without this musical framework acting as the backbeat of such a straightforward adventure, I doubt I would have been as entertained as I was simply due to the bare-bones nature of Spyro's challenges and core mechanics. Plus, even though all the musical tracks may feel cut from the same cloth, there's still enough variety for them to stand on their own, owing a great deal to the unique musical perspective and rhythmic theory of Mr. Copeland.
Pretty little instrument. You can't hit a wrong note on it.
Spyro the Dragon also does a really good job of sucking the player into its world through some very subtle bits of polish, graphical trickery, and even some clever coding. The first thing I notice upon playing is that everything feels so alive and animated just due to the amount of movement every character and enemy has. I mean, everyone kinda looks like they're made of jello, but at least they're not standing around and moving only slightly like in most games from this era. I also love the way the loading screens transition seamlessly into the skybox of the level you're entering, with Spyro doing this nice little loop-de-loop to mask the loading of each stage. It's such a small detail, but it's really quite the clever way to disguise a loading transition, and it really goes a long way towards pulling the player into this world. Overall, the presentation and production value found in Spyro are really well done, having withstood the test of time with much more grace than is typically seen from a game of this era, and the visual direction is no exception, even if everything ends up being a little rough around the edges due to the technical limitations of the time. Now, keep in mind that Spyro was released during the 5th console generation, a generation that, if we're being honest, produced some of the ugliest looking games ever created. Ugh. But even with all the technical limitations of both the era and the console they were working with, the team in Insomniac still managed to produce a game with some pretty fantastic visuals which pushed the system to its limits, to the point that, even by today's standards, the graphics have retained most of their charm. Much of this is due to the liberal use of color and the choice to create a cartoony world rather than make any attempt at photorealism. The team designed each enemy, character model, and object primarily with solid colors and more minimalistic detail rather than the densely pixelated textures found in most other PS1 titles, which actually gives Spyro a look closer to the types of games found on the N64, only with much more jitteriness. And that's probably the biggest thing to criticize the look of Spyro for, because this game seriously suffers from a bad case of texture warping. As you move about this world, walls and bits of the ground will start to warp and twist, trying desperately to adjust themselves to different camera angles. This was a common issue on the PlayStation 1 due to the system's lack of a texture mapping feature called perspective correctness. Essentially, when you move the camera in a 3D game, the system has to re-render a lot of what's on screen to account for the new perspective everything is being viewed from, and because the way the PS1 handled drawing objects and textures was largely dependent on the camera's viewing angle, sometimes the coordinates of the vertices of an object's polygons wouldn't always line up with the coordinates of those found in a previous camera position, so oftentimes things can end up jiggling around a bit, which is where much of the jello-y look of this game comes from. And Spyro the Dragon jiggles a lot, making this one of the worst offenders of this texture mapping problem that I've ever seen. Most games of this time and system manage to hide much of their warping issues through clever designs of objects or incorporating some sort of camera trickery to minimize the problem, but the team behind Spyro, for whatever reason, didn't seem to make any attempts at hiding these inconsistencies in their graphics. If I had to guess, I'd say this had something to do with the types of camera movements the team wanted to incorporate into the game, because unlike most other video game cutscenes of the time, Spyro Spyro's cutscenes feature a lot of camera panning and rotation, giving them a very cinematic feel, so most likely this was just the trade-off they had to make in order to get the effect they wanted. But in hindsight, maybe this was a little too ambitious for the time and system they were working with, because going back and playing Spyro nowadays can take a bit of an adjustment in the visual department. It's almost like slapping on a pair of glasses that are just slightly off from your normal visual acuity. This combined with the way the character animations are squashed and stretched with the aforementioned jellowiness gives the game this odd, almost psychedelic look, as if someone handed me a blotter of acid, but instead of taking it, I just sorta gave it a quick lick. Like, I don't really feel like I'm high, but I'm not entirely sure I'm sober either. Another interesting thing to note is the Japanese version of this game, which is widely considered a butchered localization job that's full of strange changes and minor tweaks that are probably the reason Spyro never had the following in Japan that he enjoyed here in the West. Overall, the game is very much the same as before, except with Japanese voices and text, but for some reason Spyro's movement speed has also been reduced a bit, making the game play out much slower than its Western counterpart. Likewise, the charge ability has also been slowed down to the point that I'd say it's roughly as fast as Spyro's normal walking speed is in the North American and European versions of the game, which of course ruins that wonderful sense of flow we talked about earlier. Though the biggest offender here has gotta be the camera, which for some reason the localization team thought needed to be locked into this weird zoomed out angle, which apart from causing all sorts of problems, since the game clearly wasn't designed with this type of camera in mind, makes controlling Spyro about as clunky and imprecise as, well, most other games of the era. And that's a shame too, because as I said previously, one of the aspects that made this game such an important milestone in gaming's history is just how well it controlled over most of its contemporaries, but my god, you wouldn't know it from playing this version. You can rotate the camera left and right just as before and use the triangle button to kinda sort of, but not really adjust the camera up and down, but overall it's just a mess and it significantly detracts from the overall enjoyment of this game, so if you're thinking of picking this up for your Japanese PS1, you might want to reconsider. Also, coincidentally enough, Spyro written in Japanese with this stylization looks eerily close to the word Ripto, which is of course the name of the villain in Spyro 2. That doesn't really mean anything, I just thought it was kinda interesting. Though as butchered as the Japanese version is, it does have one thing going for it over all other versions of the game in the way in which it utilizes the Japan exclusive Sony Pocket Station to add a little bit of extra content to the game. For those who may not be aware, this was a special memory card for the PS1 that synced up with certain games to allow you to play a series of micro games that corresponded with the save data on the card. Think of it like a PlayStation branded Dreamcast VMU, and you've more or less hit the nail on the head with what we're dealing with here. And believe it or not, a lot of Japanese versions of games had little bonuses for this system that couldn't be found in the rest of the world, and Spyro was no exception. With the Japanese version of Spyro 1, we get a minigame called Sparks Special Training, a Tamagotchi-like activity that has you raising sparks and other dragonflies in some on-the-go action. But of course, in order to raise some dragonflies, you'll have to first hunt down some dragonfly eggs, and this is honestly the coolest part of this whole thing for me. You see, when you play the Japanese version of Spyro with the Pocket Station as your primary memory card, the game will actually spawn a total of 30 dragonfly eggs throughout its world for you to find and collect. Major shout out to fellow YouTuber Crystal Fissure for taking the time to find all of these things and for bringing them to my attention in the first place. These dragonfly eggs are hidden in each level and hub world of the main Spyro game, kinda like the stop and swap items in Banjo-Kazooie, except here they actually do something because once found in the game, they will be transferred to your Pocket Station for you to hatch and raise. As far as I know, you don't get anything special for finding all of them except for the satisfaction of collecting them, and for the fact that you now have nearly 3 dozen of the little bastards to raise and take care of. Though raising may be overstating things a bit, because really all you do is try to increase basic stats through feeding and playing a couple of different minigames, which depending on how well you do will reward you with some simplistic but rather charming pixelated animations for your troubles. And hell, you can even breed dragonflies if for some reason you feel like you want more of them to play with, and as simple as it is, it's pretty cool seeing the main game sync up with a device such as this. Of course, as you might imagine, the minigames here aren't really anything special, both consisting of one of those stop the meter as close to the top as possible mechanics, followed by, I guess, the same thing but in reverse. I don't know, the whole game's in Japanese, so I'm not entirely sure how accurate what I've just said even is, but even still, it's a neat little feature that we missed out on here in the West, and I'm surprised to see that very few people have actually talked about it before. So that's pretty much Sparks' special training on the Pocket Station. Like I said, it's pretty neat, but personally, I'm not too torn up that we never got it or the Pocket Station itself here in the West, and I don't know about you, but I'd gladly trade this little distraction for the functional version of Spyro we got here any day. And really, functional, as dry as that word may be, is honestly one of the best descriptors I could think of to attribute to Spyro the Dragon, at least the Western version, because even 20 years later, it really holds up in most regards. Prior to writing this critique, I played through the game a total of 2 times, 100%ing it, or I guess 120%ing it both times, just because I was having so much fun. The little touches of polish and care that Insomniac put into this game just goes to show how passionate they were about this project, as is the fact that, in a lot of cases, they went to the trouble of writing new tools and technology just to bring their vision to life, tools and technology that would later be used or copied by other games on the system. One such tool is the level of detail renderer that was developed to make the open worlds and breathtaking vistas of the game possible, which had been a first on the platform. Level of detail is essentially a graphical trick that lowers the number of polygons and texture detail of an object the further away from the camera it becomes in order to save on system resources and avoid dips in frame rate. Back before level of detail renderers were commonplace in game engines, developers had to come up with creative ways to hide the rendering of objects from the player's viewpoint. The original Silent Hill famously added a fog effect that masked the low draw distance required to render the game, while other games simply locked the camera in certain positions or made each room you entered small and undetailed enough that object pop-in wouldn't be an issue. Spyro the Dragon, however, was one of the pioneers of this now common graphical trick, and as such was able to design its levels in a massive, sprawling manner with far-off objects and structures, making the world seem much larger than it actually is. While playing through each level, you can pretty much see every area you can go to, which makes finding treasure and dragons all the more straightforward. The challenge then becomes this sort of environmental puzzle of trying to figure out how to reach certain areas that more often than not requires the player to find a hidden path or a way to glide over a large gap and onto a far-off platform. Or the game will require you to utilize an ability called Supercharge in tandem with a ramp, which causes you to perform what's called a super jump. And this right here is unfortunately the game's biggest flaw in my opinion. Earlier I mentioned how I thought the controls had aged fairly well, and overall I still stand by that claim, but to be honest, that really only holds true for Spyro's main moveset because this ability in particular doesn't hold up nearly as well. To perform a supercharge, all you have to do is run down a slope that has arrows on it and wait until some yellow or red sparklies appear behind you. Then, to perform a super jump, you have to run to the edge of a ramp or ledge, which, if executed correctly, gives you much more height and distance than you would typically get. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, it should be, but this mechanic is a little broken, with inconsistent timing that's seemingly based on the ramp you're jumping from rather than being tied to the ability itself. Half the time you'll run to the edge of a ramp with the sparklies activated, hit the jump button, and then it's basically a roll of the dice as to whether you'll perform the super jump or just fall to your death. Ugh, I hate this so much. Up until this mechanic was introduced, I was having a blast with this game, and I really didn't have that much to complain about. Everything was fun, the gameplay was enjoyable, the controls and game concepts functioned just as they should, but then the supercharge became a thing, and immediately I found myself getting frustrated and even a little angry. There is such a tiny window where you can jump off a ramp to perform the super jump. Jump too early and you end up performing a regular jump, which causes you to hop over the lip of the ramp and fall to your death. Jump too late and Spyro will just run off into oblivion and you'll fall to your death. But then, even if you get the super jump to activate properly, the placement of the platform you need to land on will oftentimes be at the absolute maximum distance you can travel, leaving you zero room for error, or it'll be so close that you'll end up overshooting it, and guess what happens? You fall to your death! Hell, sometimes I'll be running and the supercharge will just stop working for no apparent reason. Like, I'll be clipping along, not turning and not letting go of square, and then the sparklies will just stop and Spyro will return to his regular ramming speed, forcing me to backtrack to the start of a supercharged hill and try again. Then there's the fact that in a couple of spots you need to run down 2 supercharged ramps to gain even more speed for a specific jump, but the only indication that something has changed is that the yellow sparklies surrounding Spyro changed to red, and the game never bothers to tell you that this is something you have to do. You just have to figure it out for yourself. There's also this one fucking dragon in the treetops level that requires you to supercharge and jump your way through basically the entire level, pulling off what I can only describe as speedrunner-esque tricks, and when you finally get him, Spyro says,
"Yeah, well, you could have found an easier spot to get stuck."
They fucking knew this mechanic was broken. And that's a real shame too, because every other minor issue or inconsistency that Spyro has can largely be overlooked, which only serves to make this problem with the super jump stand out even more. And if this was just a one-off thing, I could even overlook this issue as well, as large as it may be, but once the super jump is introduced, it sort of becomes a central mechanic of the remainder of the game, with a good chunk of the later levels being built entirely around supercharged tracks and ramps. Though, to be fair, once you figure out the timing for the super jump, it does get a lot easier. In fact, on my second playthrough, it wasn't nearly as problematic as I had already mastered the timing. However, that doesn't negate the fact that your only opportunities for practicing this skill are over bottomless pits, meaning that if you don't already know how to perform this action, prepare to die. A lot. And really, did the timing of this jump need to be so precise? Imagine if in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater you could only get a height bonus if you jumped off a ramp at a specific spot, and if you timed it wrong, you ended up face planting. Or I guess in this case, it'd be more like clipping through the floor and falling into oblivion. It doesn't have to be the easiest thing in the world to pull off, but above all else, performing a maneuver like this should feel good, or at the very least, function. And even now that I've mastered this ability, I still don't find it all that enjoyable to do, and mostly just do it out of a need to complete the game. Hopefully Toys for Bob will have the good sense to fix this problem with the remaster, because as it stands, this is by far the worst aspect of the game for me. And I know what some of you are going to say, that you don't have to collect all the dragons or treasure to beat the game, which means you can avoid the super jump in a lot of cases, and that I'm just looking for reasons to nitpick and blah de blah de blah. And to that I'll say what I always say, that just because something in a game is optional doesn't mean that it doesn't affect the game as a whole, and therefore it should be criticized or praised accordingly. Now, do I think this flaw somehow ruins the game? No, of course not. In fact, overall, I really enjoyed my time with Spyro the Dragon, frustrating flaws and all. It's definitely a classic worthy of the legacy it has, and I can honestly say, without any nostalgia bias, since I haven't played it until now, that it's a pretty damn good game, and I can honestly see why it's spawned such a loyal following over the years. All of the rough edges it has sort of adds to the charm for me, like I've stumbled across something truly special that's been buried and worn down over time, yet at its core is still a treasure worth cherishing. And for a great deal of people, that's exactly what it is. It was their first foray into the world of gaming, happy memories that stand proudly as the epitome of their childhood. Spyro has left an undeniable impact on the tastes and expectations of those who have played it at an early age that's just as lasting and significant as Sonic or Mario has been for people like me. The level of love and attention to detail combined with the game's stellar production value and technical achievements that laid the foundation for many games to come, as well as its laid-back nature, lovable characters, and above all else fun gameplay, for the most part, has made Spyro the Dragon a legend in the world of gaming. And after playing it that second time to get footage for this critique, I very much feel like I missed out on something quite special as a 9-year-old gamer, and I'm happy to say that after 20 years, I can finally call myself a fan. This game right here may not have pushed the medium forward or innovated as much as some of the other titles of the era, and it may not have stood the test of time as well as some of its sequels, but in terms of the amount of enjoyment and meaningful experiences it's provided an entire generation of gamers, its impact and place within gaming's history is undeniable. Spyro the Dragon is more than simply a classic, but a landmark title of the 5th console generation and a must-own for any fan of the original PlayStation. But of course, our journey's only just begun, so join me next week as we take a look at Spyro 2, Ripto's Rage. I'm Noah Lee, and thanks for watching. Hey, it's me again. I just want to take a quick moment to say thank you for taking the time to watch this video and give an even bigger shout out to all the patrons you see on screen before you. In particular, I'd like to thank Lance Baxley, Sundaraj, Evilness, Box and Jackalope, and Wako for their additional support. You guys are amazing, and I could not do this without you. Alright, I'll see you lovely little peppercorns next time. Okay, bye!